For our last story, Pope Francis is rewriting the corporal works of mercy. Instead of bury the dead, burn the dead. So
Right.
you're
Yeah.
going to tell us about that one.
Yeah, so this requires some history to understand. This is about a recent document approved by Pope Francis. So this is magisterial. This is authoritative, but we'll talk about that. It's produced by the DDF, which, as Brian mentioned, it's very confusing to call it that. It used to be known as the CDF, which itself was known as the Holy Office, which itself was known as the Holy Office of the Inquisition. But now this is basically the Archbishop Fernandez, who is one of Pope Francis's right-hand men, his way of clarifying doctrinal issues. So what happens in that document? Well, basically, the Catholic doctrine and discipline has yet again been changed on cremation. But before we get into that, I want to go over the history of cremation in the Catholic Church. Historically, the Catholic Church has, especially in the first millennium, this was a practice foreign to the mind of the Church. You can still see this in the Byzantine Code of Canon Law that you see in the Eastern Church, and even in the Eastern Orthodox, absolutely refuses to cremate, and that's because during the first millennium, pagans used to burn bodies specifically to disparage the resurrection of the dead. Now, we will say, look, that's just because you burn a body, that doesn't prohibit the person from being resurrected. But we will say, no, it is a scandal, though, because it's showing that you might even favor that position. And it's just out of respect for the human body as you're connected with your soul to take care of the body and give it a proper burial. After the first millennium, this was enshrined into Western law, both secularly and religiously. Secularly by Charlemagne, and I'll put the sources to this in the description. Charlemagne gave the death penalty for those that cremated bodies, and on the clerical level, Pope Boniface VIII, who's famous for Unum Sanctum, of course, he produced a bull in 1300 named De Sepulturis, which prohibits the boiling of the flesh, the burning of the flesh, to go bury it in another place. It's prohibited. After the French Revolution and Freemasonry, the practice of cremation was first introduced into the Western mind, and we see that the cremation societies, those became fashionable. Almost always they were Freemasonic, and it was thoroughly condemned by the Holy Office. That was on May 19th, 1886, and then on December 15th, Pope Leo the 13th ratified that document. So that is, you're talking about a lot of magisterial authority there. You're talking about an immemorial custom of the Church ratified by the Holy Office and ratified by the Pope. Finally, on July 27th, 1892, priests were forbidden to give Catholics who requested cremation last rites or a funeral mass. That got enshrined into the old Code of Canon Law. You can look at Canon 1203 and Canon 1240. Completely prohibits cremation unless there's very few circumstances, things like plague, for example. So what happens? Well, Vatican II rolls around. Pope Paul VI in the 1960s promoted as long as there's no explicit denial of Catholic doctrine in the new code, you're allowed to be cremated. But there were two very specific qualifiers with that. One, the ashes cannot be scattered, and they cannot be in one's own house. The family members cannot take ashes and then go put it in your own house. They must be buried in a vault or a cemetery. And now, my dad is actually a experienced funeral director. He's done actually hundreds of Catholic funerals. He's managed those. And he found that since that practice, about 2/3 of the cremations that were done, they were done ahead of time. And then the funeral mass was sort of done around the cremated remains. 1/3, there was a funeral mass of the body, and then the body was later cremated. So that's what the custom was.
Before you go on, one thing I want to pause on, why those 2 points is really interesting, because both those 2 points are significant. The scattering of the ashes has pagan pantheistic meaning to it, because, and the Stoics, for one of them, the idea was you're returning to nature. You're never going to rise again, because again, the Stoics in particular believe specifically you die, you're gone, you get absorbed back into nature. And then keeping them in the home is also another pagan practice, because the Romans and the Greeks before them had basically worship of the ancestors. The hearth gods were the relics, we would say, but the ashes or pieces of bodies of their ancestors that were put on the hearth and were worshipped. And so both of those two things have these real strong overtures that are sort of anti-Catholic. And like you said, it's not that God, we can limit God, that we can destroy the body and say, God, you can't resurrect it now. He certainly can, but it's our sort of statement of defiance to God in our feudal way.
Yeah, absolutely. And to change the customs like that, even if but we have to remember, this is not started with Pope Francis. This goes back to Paul VI. This goes back to the new Code of Canon Law, which allows cremation. To change a custom like that is against the mind of the church. It's disorienting for Catholics. But this year, December 9th, just a few days ago, we have a new DDF document. So I'm going to share my screen here. Going to share it here. Can you see it well, Brian?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh, actually, no, I don't see it right now. Let me
see here. I think there we go. Can you see it now?
Yes, we have it now.
Okay, great. So this is the new DDF document. So it has two questions. Firstly, it's saying, taking into account the canonical prohibition against scattering the ashes, is it possible to prepare a defined and permanent sacred place for the commingled accumulation and preservation of the ashes of the baptized, indicating the basic details of each person so as not to lose the memory of their names, similar to what occurs in ossuaries, where the mineralized remains of the deceased are cumulatively deposited and preserved? So what that's saying is, well, can you set aside remains? If you have the cremated remains, can they have a name on them and be set aside somewhere? The second one is more interesting. It says, can a family be allowed to keep a portion of their family members' ashes in a place that is significant for the history of the deceased? So that's saying, can you separate the ashes? That, again, up until now, that has been prohibited by the Catholic Church. Even the new Code of Canon Law is saying things against that. The old Code of Canon Law, absolutely not. So what do we see? In response to both, it's a yes, it's in the affirmative. I do want to read the whole thing here. For the reasons lifted above, which we can go into, basically what it is said above here is saying, well, as long as you're not outright coming out and saying you're naturalistic, as long as you're not coming out and saying you're pagan, it's fine. That's basically what is being said here.
Which is basically like, as long as you're not outright coming out and denying the church's teaching on marriage, you can commit adultery. I mean, it's sort of the equivalent, right?
And it's struggling to see that actions inform or show intent oftentimes, or at least it gives off the impression as such. So it's saying, for the reasons lifted above, a defined and permanent sacred space can be set aside for the commingled accumulation and preservation of the ashes of deceased baptized persons, indicating the identity of each person so as not to lose the memory of their names. So you can have a defined and permanent sacred space. That means, one, it seems you wouldn't have to bury the remains anymore. That used to be a very strict practice. You had to at least bury the remains together. Second one, in addition, the ecclesiastical authority, in compliance with current civil norms, may consider and evaluate a request by a family to preserve in an appropriate way a minimal part of the ashes of their relative in a place of significance for the history of the deceased person. That's completely ambiguous. That could mean a home. That could be, who knows what that could be. Are you going to put it in, if somebody worked at Walmart, you're going to put the deceased, is there, what are we doing here? I mean, it's
aisle 12, right?
Aisle 12, right? It's significance for the history. Unbelievable. Provided that every type of pantheistic, naturalistic, or nihilistic misunderstanding is ruled out, which is kind of absurd. What Catholic is going to be like, I want to make this very clear, Father. We want to cremate grandma, but I want you to know I am nihilistic, naturalistic, and pantheistic about doing this. Nobody's saying that. So as long as that's ruled out, you can have, and also provide that the ashes of the deceased are kept in a sacred place. Again, completely ambiguous. What is a sacred place? What the church used to say is that we would consecrate a graveyard. A sacred place is consecrated by the church. Now, sacred place does that mean it's a consecrated place, or does that mean it's simply significant for the history? Are we are we consecrating anything? Are we just putting it on a home altar? Or are we just putting it anywhere at the home? It's too ambiguous. And again, I want to say, I'll stop sharing my screen here. This goes against the customs of the church. They love to say, "How dare you?" You'll see this with conservatives. They'll say, "How dare you criticize the Pope?" Well, what should be asked is, we have different levels of magisterial authority. We have the ordinary and universal magisterium, it would seem, teaching over the course of over 1,000 years that this is not something Catholics should do. Now we have, it seems, a reversal. At the very least, Catholics are allowed to ask the question of, what's going on here? I don't understand. Why am I allowed to do something one day, the next day I'm not? That's not questioning the Pope's authority. I am questioning the prudence behind this decision. I think people are rightfully allowed to be confused about this and ask, well, what do we assent to? Do we assent to the authority that came before, the authority now? And the other thing I will mention is just a quick thing. They love to talk about ecumenism with the East. We've recently had a bunch of meetings with Pope Francis and the different patriarchs, and different talks between them. If you want to have ecumenism with the East, this is a terrible way to do it. This is another thing the Eastern Orthodox can claim and say, look at what you Catholics are doing, completely out of conformity with the first millennium. And this, once again, is going to make that even more difficult. They're going to be mocking us for that for quite a while. So that's what my take on it. There's a lot there, but I still think it's a very important story.
Well, and that one line that you read towards the end about, after avoiding all pantheism and nihilism, it reminded me exactly of a line out of Amazonia Corrida, the document on the Amazon Synod. And I'll paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me. But it was sort of like, as long as you avoid any pantheistic overtones, you can institute pantheistic ceremonies into the Mass. I mean, it's kind of, this is the typical MO of Francis. Qualify it, and we're not doing that. We're not changing anything. As long as we're avoiding this and that, just do it anyway. As Chris Ferrara says, just give sin a chance. But I don't know if you can bring the document up, because one last note I'd like you to show everybody, because I've seen some court apologist, again, trying to rationalize this, saying, oh, but this isn't Pope Francis. He didn't approve this. And you're on the official Vatican website. You want to point out for everybody that the last word of this document. What does it say?
Franciscus, absolutely, Franciscus.
There it is.
So this is approved, and they'll use that. And it should also be said, don't fear these conservative apologists who have nothing to say but you're going to hell if you disobey the Pope. You have the right to question this when you have over almost 2,000 years of papal teaching on your side. It should be, don't let them scare you with those kind of tactics. They have nothing except those sort of fear tactics to use against us.
Absolutely. Absolutely true.